On June the 5th, 2024, Russian Turkmen cosmonaut Oleg Kononenko set an unprecedented milestone in space exploration history by becoming the first person to spend a total of 1,000 days in space. Kononenko's achievement was the result of 16 combined years of space voyages. His journey included 5 separate expeditions to the International Space Station, during which he completed 16,000 orbits around the Earth and flew no less than 420 million total miles, the equivalent, as astronomy.com notes, of a one-way ticket to Jupiter. However, June the 5th was significant for another reason as well. Back on Earth, Boeing's CST-100 Starliner spacecraft launched from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida on its first crewed mission. Its mission was to join Kononenko and his team along with several other US astronauts aboard the ISS. On board were 2 NASA astronauts, Barry Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, whose 8-day mission was scheduled to conclude with their return to the US on June 14th. The objective was straightforward: to validate the Boeing Starliner's ability to transport crew to the ISS and back, a critical step toward regular operational missions under NASA's Commercial Crew Program. However, something went wrong. As the craft approached the ISS, a series of helium leaks were identified. This mishap forced Wilmore and Williams to extend their stay at the station. They remained there as of writing in March 2025. In doing so, they outstayed not only the Starliner itself, which returned to Earth unmanned in early September, but also Oleg Kononenko and the Russian crew who successfully returned to Earth about 2 weeks later, after 374 days at the ISS. Meanwhile, as NASA struggled to find a way to bring the stranded astronauts home, the incident raised serious questions about the entire viability of the Starliner program. And that led to a broader query: what next? To the moon and back. Boeing is not the pillar that it used to be. These sobering words came from analyst Caleb Henry during an interview with CNBC about Boeing's troubled Starliner mission. Henry went on to explain, "There was a time when Boeing was a space darling in the US. Now I think it's trying to regain territory in the midst of a very different environment from what it's used to." And he wasn't wrong. Boeing has played a storied role in the history of space exploration, with its involvement stretching back to the early days of the space race in the 1950s. In 1955, Boeing acquired McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, the company responsible for the Mercury craft and NASA's first manned space program. In the decades that followed, Boeing contributed to the development of the Atlas and Delta rockets and participated in the creation of multiple military, communications, and weather satellites for the US Department of Defense. Perhaps most significantly, Boeing was a key player in the Apollo lunar program, working on the 3rd stage of the Saturn V rocket, a critical component that helped propel the famed Apollo missions. Saturn V flew a total of 13 missions, sending 24 men to the moon, with no fewer than 12 of them setting foot on its surface between 1969 and 1972. Boeing also played a vital role in putting America's first space station, Skylab, into orbit. During the space race, the company's other contributions included building the 4-wheeled lunar roving vehicle and constructing 5 unmanned lunar orbiters. These orbiters were instrumental in mapping 99% of the moon and in determining the landing sites for the Apollo missions. Later, Boeing took a leading role in NASA's Space Shuttle program. By the 1990s, the company was selected as the prime contractor for the International Space Station itself. Boeing managed the assembly of at least 14 of the station's modules and was also responsible for manufacturing the Destiny Laboratory, the primary facility for US research on board the station. But despite all these successes, a clear shift in momentum soon became apparent. Perhaps since Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon in 1969, the intense space race between the US and the Soviet Union had already begun to lose its edge. With the collapse of the USSR in 1991, space relations entered a new era characterized by collaboration rather than conflict. At the same time, commercial air travel was taking off, and Boeing quickly redirected its focus. The company went on to dominate the aerospace industry, eventually sharing what many considered a duopoly over the jet airliner market with its European rival Airbus. Nonetheless, Boeing continued to set its sights on the uncharted territory of space navigation, a venture widely regarded as the project of the future. This ambition paved the way for the emergence of the so-called Starliner program. However, the program has struggled to achieve success. The shortcomings of the Starliner are further highlighted by the meteoric rise, no pun intended, of a new contender in space exploration, Space Explorations Technologies Corp., or, to you and me, SpaceX. The rise of SpaceX and the Columbia disaster. SpaceX handled 88% of US launches in the first 6 months of this year, and now has a de facto monopoly on getting cargo and people into space. These were the words of Wall Street Journal correspondent George Downs, who described SpaceX's pivotal role in conducting NASA space missions in mid-2023. Founded in 2002 by Elon Musk, SpaceX was created with the goal of reducing spaceflight costs and eventually making Mars colonization a reality. In the years leading up to its founding, Musk had sold his companies Zip2 and PayPal, reinvesting around $100 million of his own profit into SpaceX. An additional $100 million in equity came from investors. At that time, space travel was not a primary focus of the US Department of Defense and was on the verge of enduring one of its most notorious disasters. Space Shuttle Columbia launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida on January 16, 2003, with 7 astronauts on board. On February 1st, while attempting to re-enter Earth's atmosphere, the shuttle disintegrated, killing everyone on board. Subsequent investigations revealed that a large piece of foam had detached from the shuttle's external tank during launch, striking and breaching the spacecraft's wing. This breach allowed atmospheric gases to enter the shuttle during re-entry, leading to sensor failures and ultimately disintegration. Further inquiry uncovered that the foam risk had been known about for years, and that debris shedding from the external tank had caused damage on every previous shuttle flight, albeit typically minor. NASA came under intense scrutiny by both the US Congress and the press for allowing the issue to persist. As a consequence, space shuttle flights were suspended for more than 2 years while the disaster was thoroughly investigated. The Columbia mission was the second space shuttle disaster following 1986's Challenger, and that raised serious questions about the viability of the program. Although the tragedies were nearly 2 decades apart, both occurred when the public had largely moved on from the excitement of Cold War-era space missions. Consequently, Columbia became a significant public relations setback for NASA. Undeterred, SpaceX began developing its own space missions. The company's early years, however, were marked by struggle. Its first rocket, Falcon 1, failed in its first 3 test flights, a rather dismal start. The rocket's first successful launch and its 4th overall finally occurred in 2008. By that point, Musk later revealed the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Yet when Falcon 1 eventually reached orbit, it became the first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket to do so. This milestone represented SpaceX's first major success. That same year, NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract, effectively transforming the company into a key player in cargo delivery to the International Space Station. This landmark proved that private companies could play a major role in space exploration, and more success was to follow. In 2010, SpaceX successfully launched and recovered the Dragon spacecraft, marking the first time a commercial rocket docked with the ISS. Soon after, the company began conducting regular cargo resupply missions to the station. It also started pioneering reusable rocket technology, beginning with the Falcon 9 in 2015. Each Falcon 9 mission cost around $67 million, a significant reduction compared to NASA's space shuttle launches, which cost about $450 million each. The shuttle fleet was retired in 2011, largely due to safety concerns highlighted by the Columbia and Challenger catastrophes. Following these achievements, SpaceX continued to build on its success. In 2020, it launched the Crew Dragon Demo 2 mission, becoming the first private company to send astronauts into orbit. This mission also marked the return of human spaceflight from US soil for the first time since the shuttle program ended 9 years earlier. Since then, SpaceX has routinely ferried astronauts to the ISS as part of NASA's Commercial Crew program, and now conducts over 60% of global commercial space launches. SpaceX has emerged as a key partner of NASA, paving the way for upcoming Moon and Mars missions. In 2019, the company launched Starlink, a satellite constellation designed to provide global broadband coverage, and as of 2024, it's sent over 5,000 Starlink satellites into orbit. Additionally, SpaceX is developing the Starship, a reusable next-generation rocket intended for the ambitious missions to the Moon and Mars. Recently, Elon Musk announced that Starship's inaugural flight to Mars is scheduled for the end of 2026, with the first human landing anticipated around 2031. During the same period, Boeing might have regarded its competitor's success with a touch of dismay. Shortly before the end of the Space Shuttle program, and around the same time of SpaceX's first successful Dragon launch, Boeing set in motion its own new spaceflight initiative. In 2010, plans were announced for the development of the Crew Space Transportation, or CST-100 capsule, which later came to be known as the Starliner. With this project, Boeing presented a blueprint for a spacecraft that it hoped would allow the company to compete with SpaceX and other private enterprises, regaining a leadership role in a field that it had once dominated. However, from the very beginning, the Starliner project did not meet with the resounding success enjoyed by SpaceX. Aiming for the stars. The Starliner was proposed as Boeing's entry into NASA's Commercial Crew Development, or CCDEV program. This initiative was launched as space shuttle operations wound down, with the goal of drawing private companies into the field of spacecraft development. Boeing, although historically contracted to develop NASA hardware, benefited from generous funding to build its program. In 2014, the company won a $4.2 billion CCDEV contract, a sum that positioned it to compete with SpaceX and its Crew Dragon project. In fact, this fee significantly outstripped the comparatively modest $2.6 billion awarded to SpaceX for the development of Crew Dragon, a disparity many observers attributed to Boeing's status as NASA's legacy company, a recognition of its historical contributions to advancements in space travel. However, despite the project's much vaunted reputation, the period leading up to its launch on June 5, 2024 was marked by what can only be described as production hell. The prototype Starliner's abort engines, critical for crew safety in the event of a launch failure, experienced propellant leaks during initial tests in 2016. Soon after, issues with the avionics and software required for docking with the ISS arose, further delaying the schedule. In 2018, Boeing conducted an aborted test in New Mexico designed to demonstrate the craft's ability to safely eject the crew in an emergency. However, 2 of the 3 main parachutes failed to deploy properly, causing the test to fail. Later that same year, another propellant leak was discovered, once again delaying the program's crude testing. By 2019, Starliner was still not ready for its first human flight. In December, NASA and Boeing scheduled an unmanned test flight to the ISS for Starliner, now 2 years past the original timeline for a crewed mission. The test flight suffered a major software failure and did not reach the ISS. Only a few months later did SpaceX succeed with Crew Dragon Demo 2. Just 1 year after that, another company, Virgin Galactic, launched its founder, Richard Branson, into space. Although Virgin Galactic's test did not exceed the Kármán line, the dividing line between Earth's atmosphere and outer space, it was clear that competing companies were beginning to surge forward with their own space missions, while Starliner struggled to even get an unmanned craft off the ground. Moreover, only 8 days later, Jeff Bezos on Blue Origin accomplished what Branson had not by crossing the Kármán line into space. Perhaps bitterly for Boeing, the Kármán line, located 100 kilometers above sea level, was the very boundary for which Starliner's CST-100 had been named. It took a further 3 years after the failed 2019 launch for Starliner's uncrewed mission to finally reach the ISS on May 20th, 2022. With the rocket now deemed ready to carry crew, NASA announced in June that veteran astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams had been selected for the mission. Both astronauts were highly experienced, each making their 3rd trip to the ISS after having flown 2 missions during or shortly after the Space Shuttle period. In addition, Sunita Williams had previously been featured in a viral video tour of the station posted on the NASA Johnson Center's YouTube channel during her last expedition in 2012. The crewed launch was scheduled 1 year later in June 2023. Once again, this plan was not to materialize. The launch was pushed back when it was discovered that adhesive tape of all things inside the craft might be flammable. Additional issues were found with the rocket's parachute system. Consequently, the launch was postponed repeatedly, finally taking place on June 5, 2024. Failure is not an option. Before departure, Wilmore confidently told reporters, "You know the adage you've heard since Apollo 13, failure is not an option." Despite the project's challenges, both the astronauts and NASA remained optimistic about the upcoming venture. After being pushed back once again in May 2024 and then once more on June 1st, just minutes before takeoff, the launch finally took place. Starliner departed from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida on June the 5th at 10:52 a.m. local time. However, problems arose immediately. Despite Wilmore's bold statement, the tragedies of Challenger and Columbia serve as stark reminders that failure had indeed occurred since Apollo 13, a reality that NASA kept keenly in mind. While his words may have been intended as a metaphor for the potential deadliness of a space system's failure, Starliner's 2024 launch demonstrated that outcomes can fall anywhere between success and total failure. 1 month before launch, a small helium leak was detected on the craft. Helium is used to push propellant to the rocket thruster systems that are crucial for both maneuvering in space and slowing the vehicle down for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. The leak was minor, likely a one-off occurrence, and engineers were confident that it would not impact the mission. The launch proceeded as planned. Other minor issues, however, began to surface as the launch date drew near. In the days leading up to June 5th, problems were identified with the International Space Station's urine recycling system. As a result, Williams and Wilmore had to forgo a significant portion of their luggage because the available space on the craft needed to be reallocated for the replacement parts required to fix the faulty system. In this case, the fault did not lie with Boeing. Similarly, the delay on June 1st was not due to Boeing either. Rather, it was caused by a malfunction in one of the computer systems on the launch pad, which triggered an automatic halt. United Launch Alliance, the company responsible for the launch site, offered their apologies. However, the mid-flight problems were an entirely different matter. The helium leak turned out to be more significant than anticipated, and 4 additional leaks were discovered after launch. Consequently, 5 of Starliner's 28 thrusters shut down en route to the space station. Despite these challenges, Wilmore and Williams successfully arrived on June the 6th after a 27-hour flight, receiving a rapturous welcome at the ISS. Still, the mid-flight issues were severe enough to warrant a full analysis. Before long, the space station would become the astronauts' home for an almost indefinite period. Exile to space. On June the 28th, Mark Nappy, Boeing's vice president of the Commercial Crew Program, made a memorable statement to reporters. By then, it had been 2 weeks past the scheduled return of Starliner, which was to carry Wilmore and Williams back to Earth. "We're not stuck on the ISS," he declared. "The crew is not in any danger, and there's no increased risk when we decide to bring Sonny and Butch back to Earth." But stuck is exactly what Wilmore and Williams were on the ISS. What was intended to be a 9-day observation mission had since turned into a 9-month exile in outer space. On June the 14th, NASA announced that the return of Starliner, originally scheduled for that same day, would be delayed until June 22nd. This extra time would allow engineers to further analyze the craft's propulsion systems, including the helium leaks and other thruster malfunctions. To date, a complete resolution to these issues has not been found, and a NASA safety panel is still investigating them. Back in June, when these issues were beginning to mount, the timing could not have been worse for Boeing. A few days before Nappy's announcement on June 18th, Boeing's CEO, James Calhoun, submitted formal testimony to a U.S. Senate committee regarding 2 deadly commercial airline disasters involving the company. In 2018, Lion Air Flight 610, a domestic flight between 2 Indonesian airports, crashed, claiming all 189 lives on board. Merely 6 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, traveling from Addis Ababa to Nairobi, also crashed, costing all 157 lives aboard. Both aircraft were Boeing 737 MAX 8s, and in each case, faulty flight software was identified as the culprit. These tragedies led to a 2-year worldwide grounding of the jet and sparked an investigation into its future viability. In his testimony, Calhoun apologized to the families of the victims while staunchly defending both the durability of Boeing's aircraft and the company's adherence to safety protocols. Yet, very few would have been reassured by emerging reports that simultaneously called into question the durability of Boeing's space rocket. Boeing, however, maintained its confidence in Starliner's ability to return crew safely, pointing to extensive testing of the propulsion system both in space and on the ground. Yet one organization did not seem to share that optimism: NASA. Reports indicate that NASA and Boeing executives clashed over Starliner's capacity to safely bring the stranded astronauts back to Earth. In September, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson delivered a sobering announcement. NASA has decided that Butch and Sonny will return with Crew 9 next February, and that Starliner will return uncrewed. The decision to keep Butch and Sonny aboard the International Space Station and bring the Boeing Starliner home uncrewed is a commitment to safety. In other words, the astronauts will ultimately be returned to Earth by SpaceX as part of the next ISS rotation scheduled for February 2025. What's next for Starliner? The SpaceX flight set to return Williams and Wilmore to Earth is, in fact, SpaceX Crew 10. As its name suggests, this mission marks the 10th NASA Commercial Crew Program flight and the 17th crewed orbital flight of a Crew Dragon spacecraft. Although it was originally scheduled for February, the mission was postponed by a month to provide SpaceX and NASA enough time to complete final testing and integrate the new spacecraft. The rocket lifted off from Florida on March the 14th, shortly after 7 p.m. local time, and docked with the space station approximately 29 hours later. The successful return of the astronauts via the SpaceX rotation mission, although a major blow to Boeing's reputation, was far from the worst-case scenario for Boeing or the United States as a whole. Had Crew Dragon not been available, Washington might have had to rely on Russia to retrieve the stranded astronauts from the ISS, a scenario that in today's tense geopolitical climate would have been a major humiliation for Washington and significantly more expensive. Instead, Williams and Wilmore will be wearing the spacesuits of Boeing's primary competitor as they descend from the station, which is a far less severe indignity than having US astronauts don the suits of Russia's Roscosmos. In the meantime, several significant developments took place aboard the space station during their extended stay. The astronauts inadvertently became part of ISS Expedition 72, which officially began after members of Expedition 71, including Oleg Kononenko, departed the ISS on September 23rd aboard Russia's Soyuz MS-25, making room for a new team of 3 cosmonauts. At that point, Anita Williams assumed command of the ISS, and in January she became the female astronaut with the longest accumulated spacewalk time in history, totaling more than 60 hours. Both Williams and Wilmore acknowledged the unexpected circumstances during an in-space interview, noting that unforeseen obstacles are an inherent aspect of test missions. Anita Williams described the space station as a happy place, while Butch Wilmore expressed pride in rejoining the big city in the sky. Still, both missed significant personal commitments back on Earth, and the delay in their retrieval only intensified the scrutiny surrounding both Boeing and the Starliner project overall. As it stands, the viability of Starliner appears to be in dire straits. Beyond the embarrassment of NASA reaching out to its direct competitor for assistance, the consequences for Boeing extend well beyond mere public humiliation. In the words of Mika Maidenberg speaking to the Wall Street Journal, SpaceX has now flown 9 different missions for NASA. Boeing has flown, we'll call it half a mission. Since this statement, SpaceX has successfully flown a 10th mission, Crew 10, into space. As Time magazine pointed out in September 2024, this is almost certainly not the end of Boeing's involvement in space travel. The company remains the prime contractor for key components of NASA's Space Launch System moon rocket, which is intended to return US astronauts to the moon in 2026. However, as Time magazine writer Jeffrey Kluger noted, the Starliner segment of Boeing's portfolio is likely to go by the boards. Starliner has proven to be overpriced and has failed to meet any of its key deadlines during nearly 15 years of development. Moreover, Kluger highlighted that the International Space Station is aging, with its first component having gone into service almost 27 years ago. NASA plans to decommission the space station entirely by 2030, which means that, at best, there will only be 6 more missions available for both SpaceX and Boeing to complete. Meanwhile, SpaceX has already set its sights on loftier ambitions with its Mars mission, in stark contrast to Boeing, which has yet to successfully execute even its first crewed mission to space and back. With this in mind, Boeing may have missed its window to demonstrate its potential contribution to the future of space travel. Meanwhile, the modest results of its space endeavors have heavily weighed on its own resources. The company quickly exhausted the $4.2 billion it received from NASA in 2014 and incurred an additional $1.6 billion in charges during the program's development. In September 2024, Boeing's stock fell 7.3% after Wells Fargo downgraded the company to an underweight rating. And all of this has occurred without the company having completed the heralded space mission in its entirety, without fully resolving Starliner's problems, and without even addressing the planned 2026 moon rocket launch, estimated to cost NASA around $4.1 billion per launch. The future looks bleak for Starliner, and perhaps even for the once great legacy of Boeing's operations in space. Thank you for watching.